Hey everybody, Steve here from The Varied Life, and today this is what we're talking about, Colorado prisons. Yeah, I know a thing or two about prisons. Kind of a sordid type of history, not as bad as you would think, but I did my time in the military, I'd gotten in trouble, nothing real big, just minor, minor things, it's kind of brushed under the rug. And it ends up before my time in the military. I actually spent a night in jail because of some juvenile activities. So, yeah, breaking and entering, assault on an officer, carrying concealed weapon, and a number of other charges that they trumped up against this little innocent child, teenager that was bored. And, yeah, it was just kind of interesting. And I ended up going to the jail, the adult jail, even though I was a minor. I think I was 15 years old at the time. And yeah, they didn't care. They put me in with big boys and scared the crap out of me. And yeah, that was enough. One night in jail was enough. But thankfully, the crimes that I committed as a juvenile were sealed, and they were not bad enough that I could not get into the military. Matter of fact, me going into the military was highly advised by the judge. Yeah, you hear the old stories of people that are like, well, it's either go to jail, go to prison, or join the army. It wasn't as extreme as that, but it was. I stood before the judge, and the judge's like, here's what's going on, and we're going to, you're spend a night in jail, you're going to be on probation for a year, and you're going to have to meet with a parole officer and the whole 9 yards and do all this stuff. Of course, I was grounded for a year, so I didn't have a life. My stepfather at the time, took away every civilian thing that I owned, comic books, games, the whole 9 yards, and all I could have was school books in my room. I couldn't even have a radio. I could go to school, church, and home, and I couldn't have anybody over. I couldn't go anywhere besides church. And nobody could call me, and I couldn't call them. Yeah, so it was very interesting. But during that time, the judge says, if you keep your nose clean and come back and give me assurance that you are going to be on the straight and narrow, that you have a plan for your life, go to school, trade school, military, whatever it is, blah, 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 we will see on what we can do with these. Now, this is very interesting because as a child and as a minor, I did not know at that time that my records would be sealed. So it didn't really give a damn, but the judge, apparently my stepfather knew the judge, and I think they coerced amongst themselves and kind of pushed me into the realm of the military, because that would be a plan for my life, and then if I screwed up, it was the military's responsibility and not mine. So after probation and all of that, and keeping my nose squeaky clean, sort of, my parents never found out a number of the escape attempts and escapes that I did from the house, and lots of things, of course, lying and, oh yeah, we're going to youth camp, whatever, overnight or whatever, and I didn't. Going to a teenage Bible study, didn't, went out and did various extracurricular activities, and so that was kind of interesting. But I did my career in the military, and after I got out, I ran into a buddy of mine that I actually served with in the military who had retired while I was in Korea. He did his last year in Korea. I was here, and I was a partier, he wasn't, and we had a real good relationship, and gave me his phone number. And so when I got out of the military, it was like a couple of years later. I did my 20 years. So there was a lot of time between when I met this guy, Pete, who was my boss in the military as an E7, and I think I was E5 at the time, and E4 coming up on E5, whatever it was. But ran across his phone number, ended up calling at the behest of my daughter, who, we're going through and we're throwing out stuff for moving and all that, and she found Pete's phone number and address, which was like 30 minutes away from where we lived. And it's like, you got to be crazy. So I called the number. There's no way after 20 some odd years, 30 years or whatever, that he would have the same phone number. Get an answering machine. And sure enough, it was Pete's wife that picked up the phone and says, yeah, we were just talking about you last night. What the hell? That was absolutely insane. So this is all part of the backstory. Pete was employed by the Colorado Department of Corrections. And he goes, man, he goes, it is the easiest job in the world compared to the military. He says, you can count on one hand and you can survive. And it's like, I can count to some pretty big numbers, but, and I don't even need my hands. He goes, you're qualified. And so I kind of put it off. Real estate investing with family went south and so on and so forth. And I was like, well, I need money. So I applied for the Colorado Department of Corrections. I took the test. I scored 100. Of course, I had veterans preference, so I had 105. You'd figure somebody that scores 100 and got 105 on the score, they would be knocking down your door to work in corrections, especially with somebody who was a veteran, who had firearms experience, overseas, the whole 9 yards. Nope. I called back like every quarter, and it's like, yeah, no, nothing yet. And this was at the time when the Colorado Department of Corrections, which always seems to be understaffed, was understaffed and desperately needing people. And here I am, out to my own horn. I was cream of the crop compared to all of the things that they wanted. I was in military police and so on and so forth. I was an instructor, done hand-to-hand combat and stuff like that. Matter of fact, I was a Krav Maga instructor. I got certified at that early on after I got out. So, yeah, it seemed like I had everything going for me. I was teaching concealed carry weapons permit classes and shoot, move, and communicate. Do you think they would look at these things and say, this is the man that we want? No. It was over a year later that I got a call, and it's like, hey, is this Steve Wilson? I'm like, yeah. Who's this? And it's like, well, we're wondering if you're interested in the job. And I'm like, and what job are you talking about? This is a red flag that I should have paid attention, because hindsight is 2020. But when the person that called me asked me and said, hey, are you interested in the job? And they didn't say what the job was, and that's kind of like, after over a year, they just call me out of the blue saying, yeah, we're I'm so-and-so from Colorado Department of Corrections. We're wondering if you're still interested in the position. And it's like, yeah, I'm kind of wondering why it took so long. I had a score of 105, correct? And it's like, well, things drop through the cracks in corrections, and he laughs, and I'm just kind of like, that's a bad omen. So long story short, I go to the basic training for Department of Corrections, which was the easiest thing in the world to do. If you can breathe and halfway pay attention, it's like a month and a half, something like that. I can't remember how many weeks. Go in, take some classes, take an exam, boom. I was barely paying attention, and I was able to pass and exceed the standards for everything there. And then when it came to hand-to-hand combat and handcuffing and all that stuff, of course, and firearms, of course, I excelled extremely well. And I was amazed at the lack of skill and the lack of qualifications that other future correctional officers had. You had people that were failing tests, and the instructors were kind of like, they had to restudy, and then they had to take a retest, and you could do that like 3 times. But like on the third test, it's kind of like the instructor would be there, and this is what was told to me by a person who failed twice, and they were taking the third test, and they were looking over their shoulder, and as they were filling out you remember the little bubble chart like you did in school, the bubble chart test where you circle in the bubble for the answer A, B, C, or D, and the person would go to and have their pencil on B, and then the instructor would be like, and so it's like, and the instructor's sitting there, a couple other people, and they're like, yeah, I don't know how today's going to go. And then the person would move their pencil over to A. It's like, yeah, I don't think today's going to be a good day. I'm just not feeling it. And then so they kind of move their pencil over to C, and it's like, but yeah, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I'm going to go get a beer after work and blah. And so that's how the test went. At least that's through the person that had to take 3 tests. And we had other people that didn't even pass tests because it was so bad. There was actually a person there that didn't write their name down correctly on a test. And it's like, yeah. Then you had people who got DUIs, got busted for drugs, while they were in basic training for being a correctional officer. And so through attrition, it was pretty bad. The turnover rate is more than 50% back then. It was amazing. There was people that after correctional officer training, you get sent to whatever prison that you're going to go to. And I remember walking through, and I was going to Territorial Prison, which is the, matter of fact, the oldest prison in the state of Colorado. I think it was like 1840s, something like that. It was before Colorado became a state. Territorial Correctional Facility still has the original walls from back then. Yeah, so it's a pretty rundown prison. I will tell you that much. Tons of work, understaffed, the whole 9 yards. So I go to Territorial Correctional Facility, and as you go through and they give you your brief and you get your sponsor and you get your tour and you get it in processing, and so you got to go to all these different offices, you got to get briefings and safety tips and this and that. And then as we're walking through, you go through the Sally Port. So there's some bars, like jail bars, that automatically open. You walk in and this closes, and so you're in this room. And then there's another set of bars and doorways, so you're locked in. And then they open up these doors, and then you're able to go into the prison. So it's a double barrier security. So in case if that door's open and inmates run in and try to get out of the facility, they still have this locked door. So, but when that second door closed behind us, there was a guy that was bigger than me. Of course, I wasn't as big as I am now. I'm 255 now, but I think I was like 205, 210, somewhere around there. Around 200 pounds, 6'2". And this guy was bigger than me, a little chunkier than me. And he was Mr. Badass. And by the end of the day, he was gone. He quit because he couldn't handle the clanking of the doors of the prison, of him being inside prison, and being in a prison where you might have, 200, maybe 300 staff at best, and you've got thousands of inmates. Yeah, it really freaked him out. So he quit. So I worked at Territorial Correctional Facility. I worked in transportation there for the incoming and in processing when you had, it's like a temporary, what was it, Cell House 5, I think it was, 3 or 5, one of the two. One was in processing, where it was kind of like temporary holding for inmates that were coming in and out of Territorial, and then the other was SEG. I want to say 3 was SEG, but I worked both of those, and I worked cell houses like 7 and 10 and whatever, and Cell House 4, and I did the guard stuff, and I did the tower stuff, and all of that stuff, and I ended up being a training officer because it was too easy for me to do, and we would train during graveyards. So with that, I've got to be around, like, it would be me and one other guard in the yard with about 300-400 inmates. And we were it. That was it. And sure, you had guards up in towers, but I mean, some of the people that are correctional officers, you would not trust them with a paint gun, or a pea shooter, let alone a firearm, because one, old, decrepit, they don't know how to fire the gun. It's, everybody qualifies, given enough time and support. So in a real life situation, yeah, it just wasn't, I didn't gain a lot of comfort from most of the guards that were up in the towers. There was a few good ones, but most of the time it was, fat, overweight, they're getting their paycheck and so on and so forth. They're not concerned about security. The majority of these people who are correctional officers never spent any time in the military. Never spent any time in law enforcement, and it shows. Some of these people, power goes to their heads, and so they're the jerks, kind of like what you see on TV, the crappy correctional officers or guards that go out of their way to make inmates' lives difficult. And I've seen a lot of that, unfortunately, and I don't like that. And there's kind of a reason for that, because working in the military, you work with all kinds of people, and I actually worked in conjunction with 249th Confinement Facility at Camp Humphreys and dealing with the inmates who were there and so on and so forth. And in the military, you always treat people with respect, regardless of what they call you or your family, your wife, your mother, whatever. I've seen it all. But people that don't have that type of experience will take that shit personally, and they lose their cool, they lose their professionalism, and it just ends up they're not firm, fair, and consistent at all, and it just ends up being bad. So there was that. So I ended up being a correctional officer for a couple of years at Territorial, and yeah, it was. I've seen fights. I've seen people getting stabbed. I've seen people shoving stuff up their butts. You know, their prison purse with drugs and certain other things. You know, knives, shanks. There's some weird stuff. Pens. What else? Marbles. People would shove stuff up their. Yeah, it's like what? Food. Yeah. So don't ever accept food from an inmate. Just saying, it's not a thing. And even though there are some inmates in prison that are totally, they've been unjustly convicted, and there's a number of organizations that show that at least 15 to 20% of the people in United States prison are there unlawfully. In other words, they're innocent. Yeah, still don't accept food from inmates while you're on the job. It was funny because I remember this one guy, this new guy, and it was towards the end of my time at Territorial, and this guy's like going through, and he was real friendly with the inmates, this one guard, a younger kid, and he was an idiot. There's a story about him, but he kind of pal around, and he kind of gave favors to inmates, and so that's why they liked him, and that's why they, hey, have some candy or whatever, this or that. And one time it was like made him a burrito, and he's walking down the hall, and he's got this burrito, and he's eating it. And I was with this guy who was a sergeant, and we see this guy. It's like, man, hey, you got a burrito, man. That looks good. Yeah. Of course, we're working on swing shift that time. And it ends up, I had to stay over, or actually come in early prior to my graveyard shift, and he was also there. And he's like, yeah, the guys made me a burrito. And it's like, and it's interesting because you go through times of briefings before you go on shift, and they talk about all the incidents that happened in the past 24 hours. And so it would go something like this. Okay, the shift commander comes up, and he's got this notepad, and he's looking at it, and he's okay, well, in the last 24 hours we had this, we had a certain amount of fights, we had this person and this person go to segregation, we had this and that, and this one got evac'd out for a medical emergency, so we lost 2 people for that, for escort, blah blah blah. We caught so and so trying to smuggle out meat in his crotch between his butt cheeks. As he was being patted down, the meat fell from betwixt his cheeks, and it fell down his pants, and it rolled out on the floor. And you would hear these things, people tying pieces of cheese and meat to their crank and hanging it down in their shorts. And that's because you can't take food from the mess hall to your cell, and so they got to hide it. So either you're hiding it as you go to eat, or if you work in the mess hall, that's where the majority of the food comes from, is those people would sneak that out. And you can't check every single inmate that goes and works there because you just don't have the manpower. It's just not feasible. The other prison that I worked at was Fremont Correctional Facility, which had 6,000 beds, I think it was, 4,000 or 6,000 beds. And the max staff that you would have during the day would be like 300 people. And that's including admin. So you have a minimal amount of people, and it's even worse on graveyards. You have even lower amounts of staff. So you go down to graveyard minimums, which is barely anything. So when you have 20 or 30 inmates that are working in a dining facility preparing the food for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you can't strip search or pat everybody down. So it's a game. It's a numbers game. And the inmates will win from time to time, and the guards will win from time to time. So, yeah, it was just kind of like so you hear these stories of inmates that are smuggling meat, cheese, other things in their crotch and their butt cheeks, or, under the folds of their fat, because some of these guys are really big. And why would you accept a burrito from an inmate? I just don't get it. It boggles the mind on what would happen with that. So from there, I worked at Fremont Correctional Facility, which at the time when I got there and I did like 8 years there. 8, 9, 10. I did like 10, almost 11 years total in Department of Corrections, and I got promoted to lieutenant, and I did security electronics and things like that. So when you see Fremont Correctional Facility, and you see the cameras, and you see, the electric fence and the stun fence and all that, that was me. I would do all that stuff, and I would do all the control panels for all the doors and all the cells and so on and so forth. So there was a problem with those, I'd repair those and fix the panels and the buttons and the computers, the PTZ cameras, and cameras that somebody hit the electric fence, it would stun them. It was a stun fence, and then cameras would automatically lock on to that zone. So we had camera coverage, and those cameras would automatically turn and go to and focus on the point of where that alarm went off. So yeah, I've done fiber optics and things like that. So yeah, it's kind of an important job, keeping people locked up, But Fremont Correction Facility at that time, when I first got there, was known as it was the sexual abuse camp, I guess you could say, for sex offenders. So it was like a sex offender camp and a retraining. So you had people that had sex offenses against adults, against children, minors, animals, along with murders and rapists. It was a medium R facility, and for the people that were really bad, they would go to CSP, which was not the Supermax ADX, but the Supermax for the state corrections, and that was a bad place. I've worked a few shifts there, and I don't ever want to. That place is where the worst of the worst for state prisons. That's the CSP. That just was really bad there. So anyway, working at Fremont, I got to know a lot of different inmates, because not only working on cameras that are outside the facility, but inside the facility, inside the cell houses themselves. I worked on the cell doors. And then since, I did electronic stuff, I also worked on the cable TV. I also worked on radios and things and all of that stuff. So I got to, and then of course I had to change lighting and so on and so forth in individual cells and buttons and the whole 9 yards. So I was constantly busy, and there's quarterly and monthly maintenance that we had to do. Cameras had to be adjusted because inmates would break them and, move them around and stuff, and we charged them for that. But that was kind of interesting. But I want to talk about this right here, because there was this guy that I was watching, and what we end up seeing is this guy here. Where am I? Oh, there I am. Donut operator. Guy's ankle blown apart to pieces by an officer, and I was just kind of doom scrolling on YouTube here. But it goes through, and of course, that's not what I'm going to talk about here. It ends up that here it talks about a guy that, let me see if I can find it.
What?
And of course, we're going to get a commercial. So as I'm doom scrolling on YouTube and stuff like that, it comes across this that happened. And basically what ended up happening is this guy was running away from law enforcement. He shot at them a couple of times. He ran his truck through this 7-Eleven and into the 7-Eleven, and then he hops out. And as it's going through the story,
you can see him narrowly missing a customer who nearly had his last Slurpee ever.
So there it shows. Now the guy gets out. And when I saw that guy right there, I was like, oh, seriously, really? That guy looks familiar. Now, this is
his
Castle Rock, Colorado.
Was to trap himself inside a 7-Eleven, and officers are surrounding it. I don't know how this plan is going to go for him.
Not well.
305 Abbey just ran through the store. Put your hands up! Put your hands up! Hands up!
Now, this is all going to come to, there's a point to all this, and it's going to be pretty interesting.
And then our little Slurpee destroyer decides to do this.
He's got his dog. He pulls a gun. He shoots a couple of times at the officers.
This dude is cornered with nowhere to go and perfectly visible to the officers who are surrounding the store. Then does the smartest thing ever and decides to aim his gun at officers.
You know I can see through my windows, right?
I don't believe I have to tell you what happens next. You're here watching my videos for a reason.
Put your hands up! Hands up! Hands up!
Shots fired.
305 Adams, shots fired! Shots fired! Put your hands up! Put your hands up! Hands up! Hands up! Gun! Hands up!
So anyway, it ends up that
IQ out of anyone inside the entire 7-Eleven because as soon as bullets started flying, he noped the f out of there. The man firing at officers was not so lucky though. He got hit 6 times and survived his injuries. Somehow, the power of
Dad's finding a f***ing chair sponsor immediately.
The power of stupid overcomes all sometimes. He is currently in custody at the Douglas County Detention Center under a $500,000 bond. And that's all I have for you fine people today.
Now, here's the interesting thing that I want to talk about is that this is the guy. The man who fired at officers during the high-speed chase was sentenced to 64 years. Kyle Williamson. So what does this have to do with me being in prison or working in prisons? I knew this guy at Fremont Correctional Facility, obviously not with this because this happened in 2023, which was last year. But yeah, he had prior convictions and he had served in the Department of Corrections before he did this. And so when I saw that video, I was like, that guy looks familiar, and it's in Castle Rock. And so I was like, okay, let me look up in the Colorado Department of Corrections. And yeah, parolee sentenced to 64 years in prison for shooting. And there he is, boom. And I'm like, that's Kyle. I knew that dude when I was in corrections and working at Fremont. So I pulled out his information because this isn't like special secret information. This is actually, you can get this on this website. And there he is. And so he's eligible for parole in 2071. So he's got another 47 more years. He'll be like 80 years old. And so he's probably going to die in prison. 6'1", 218 pounds. He was a little bit bigger than me when I was there. And now I'm definitely bigger than him, and I've got better accommodations. But down here on the bottom, it shows that he was at Adams County, that he was sentenced in 2011 for a number of crimes there. He had 14 years on this one, 3 years on that one. And then, of course, this 2024 is where he got the rest of those. But during his initial sentencing back in 2011, he ended up going, and he was at Fremont Correctional Facility. I actually think he was a territorial, but I can't really remember if it was him or not, because there's a lot of white guys that have bald heads, and they all kind of look the same, do the Aryan Brotherhood thing. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. On seeing that video of that guy, and I was like, wow, that I know that guy. So small world, and unfortunately, there's a lot of people. Like I said, there's about 15 to 20% of people that are in prison unjustly, that are innocent, on trumped-up charges that shouldn't be in prison at all. Cases should have been dismissed. I know some people that actually got their cases dismissed in the whole 9 yards. And it's a travesty of the Colorado justice system, because when you see up close and personal what goes on in Colorado prisons, and when you get to, I had access to people's files and see their MIDMIS and all their stuff to see what they're charged with. I've had inmates show me their court records and so on and so forth, saying, hey, I'm innocent, blah, 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 we're doing appeals. You can't say, oh, well, you're innocent, so I'm not going to enforce the rules. No, you have to enforce the rules. It doesn't matter if the guy's innocent or not. Your job is to enforce the rules. I've seen people get let out of prison because they were there unjustly, and on appeal, they were let go scot-free. It's happened. There's other inmates who said, I am innocent and I'm going for an appeal, And I remember this one guy, he was caught with making meth and distributing drugs. Meth was his thing, and he used to do it in a U-Haul truck. And kind of a wild guy, but nice guy. He just made a lot of meth. Other than that, he was okay, and his meth problem. So, but he goes and he says, yeah, my lawyer's doing this and we're doing this, and he'd show me his court records and his appeals that he's doing. He says, I'm going to be out of here, and because of the misuse of evidence and blah blah blah. And I remember when he went to court and he was gone for a number of days, and then he came back, and it flipped the script. It turned on him in the opposite direction. He didn't get let off. He caught an additional 14 years. So yeah, and he was pretty miserable, So there's people that worked for me besides him. That one old guy, what was his name? He came and worked for me. He was a veteran. He was committed to murder, but he was kind of an ass. But he could kind of sort of do his job. But then he ended up getting caught lying and stealing stuff out of our shop and so on and so forth. And then forging appointment slips and saying that he had to go to appointments when he just wanted a day off, which was weird because I told him, I said, dude, if you want a day off, just ask. I'm totally different than a lot of the other staff. If you're just, you're sick of work or whatever, you just need a mental health day, let me know and I'll let you have a day off, But the thing that he would do is that he would say he would have an appointment, and then the state would still have to pay him as if he had a job for that day. And so he wanted the day off, but he wanted to get paid as well. And that's what the whole deal was. But he was wrong as the day is long. And he ended up through some DNA evidence later. He was getting short. It looks like he was going through, getting ready to do parole in the whole 9 yards. He was kind of excited. He was an older guy. He'd spent decades in prison. And then there was this DNA thing that came up, and he caught a case, and his DNA convicted him, and I think it was back in the late 70s or early 80s, something like that, of a case of where he had killed a woman, and he was done. He's going to die in prison. The other interesting thing with prison, besides my one night in jail, which was in prison, was my dad. This is kind of interesting because if we take a look at this right here, and of course if I click this and show you what I'm actually looking at, it might actually help. What are the odds? Let's put me over here. Here we see in the Vale Trail, January 26, 1996, Bob Mack is sentenced to life in prison for murdering his wife. Defense to seek retrial based on psychiatrist testimony. This was my dad. And long story short, a little bit of background, my mom and my dad. I came to be. He was a Vietnam veteran. Of course, he had some anger and PTSD issues along with some drug use and alcohol. Divorced back when I think I was like 12. Yeah, I think I was about 12 at the time. I never saw him again after that. Well, no, I take it back. I saw him a couple times, but then things went bad, and then I never saw him after that. Apparently, he cleaned up his life, and what he ended up doing is getting a couple of degrees. And Robert S. Mock, that's my dad's name, is that he had turned his life around. He worked overseas in Europe, and then he came back to Colorado. Again, he was in Vail, and he worked as human resource or something like that, working in education or whatever. But it ends up, let me see if I get this. Robert Mock hung his head and wept silently as judge sentenced him to life in prison for the January 19th murder of his wife, Mimi Mock. He was convicted of first-degree murder last month for the death of his wife on Memorial Day of 1994. Mock argued that he shot his wife in the heat of passion after a long argument. There is no legal justification for someone to take extreme action of killing another person, no matter how much verbal abuse and berating that person heaps. This is really interesting because the one thing I do know about my dad was he was taller than me. I'm 6'2", and I think he was 6'3", 6'4", and he's kind of a big guy. So, is this the one that shows the picture? No, it doesn't. So anyway, Yeah, so he got sentenced to life in prison, and at the time that I started working for corrections, he was in Colorado Department of Corrections, so I had to disclose that on my application. Do you have a family member or anybody that you know that's in the Department of Corrections? Because if there was, either they would move that person that I knew to another prison, or I would have to go work in another prison, or I would have to quit. He ended up being in a prison that was far away from the one that I was at. So anyway, it ends up that it goes through all this stuff that they didn't have anything to say, carries a mandatory life sentence. And when I looked up when I was in the Department of Corrections and he was still alive, his parole date was like 3009. So yeah, he was going to die in prison. That would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He'll die there, said District Attorney Pete Michelson. And he ended up doing an appeal for a number of things, and it just didn't go well. And yeah, the court concerned that, it just, what he was trying to say is he wanted to bring in evidence for the blood alcohol content to try to sway, saying that his wife at that time wasn't under the right mind, and that's why he was in fear for his life, and that's why he shot her twice. But when the court records show that when he shot his wife twice, then he called the police and said, I shot my wife. And so it wasn't really clear that it's like, hey, my wife was attacking me or whatever. That wasn't it. So that was kind of a weird thing. And that's actually him right there on the left. So hands down, it's first-degree murder, and that ends up here. Preliminary hearing in Eagle County. After 4 hours of deliberation and an eight-day trial, Robert Mock was convicted of first-degree murder. It's just whether it was warrant, they said it was premeditated and so on and so forth. So that was kind of interesting. It was what it was, and so it was really interesting. And so a psychiatrist testified, and of course there was some problems with that, and what was his mental state. The testimony of the psychiatrist said that he was deliberate. In other words, that he had thought this through, and records of Mock's mental health from those from Town of Vale and others. What does it say? Weave together and paint a picture of character traits including obsessive compulsive, narcissistic, haughty, and others. Those come out over and over and over. The psychiatrist described other personality traits based on the defendant's year and a half in jail awaiting trial. Correction records given insight into the defendant when he thinks he is not being watched very closely. Although Mock does not have a personality disorder, he is manipulative and can talk his way out of some things. So, talk about a dysfunctional childhood. Yeah, I can attest to that. Let's see what else to say. Of course, the other side wanted to move for a mistrial because they didn't have time to rebuttal. But anyway, it ends up that all of that was, the appeal failed, and it ends up that good old dad there ended up dying in prison. And at the time when I started working at the prisons that I did at Territorial and Fremont, he was at Sterling. He was at Sterling Correctional Facility. And I was actually, because I hadn't seen him or talked to him, I had joined the military. I heard and was contacted by the state prosecutor's office, and my mom had told me, hey, you need to call this number, even though I was in Korea. So I called during one of my free calls that I got while I was in Korea and talked to the prosecutor, and they wanted me to come to the trial to attest to his character as a kid. And it's like, he was a bad parent and it wasn't good. A lot of beatings, things like that. I remember alcohol, him being drunk, even at a young age, I remember that. But I'm in the United States Army and I'm stationed in Korea, so I can't just hop on a plane and, show up. It's just not a thing. So after a few more phone calls and getting the information to the prosecutor, apparently they didn't feel that they needed me because they had enough evidence already, and obviously they did. So yeah, that was really interesting. So I know a thing or two about prisons, and seeing Kyle Williams on that we ended up seeing there, dude there on that donut operator little piece that he did, that was kind of interesting, and it brought back some memories. And so what I ended up doing is with this, I started looking and searching online for Colorado Department of Corrections and Fremont Correctional Facility, Territorial, and seeing video clips and all that, and say, hey, I worked in that cell house, and I know that, and I've been there. And that's so-and-so, I know him, in some of the news footage of the guards and inmates and things like that was kind of wild. And then seeing Fremont Correctional Facility where, hey, I put up every single one of those cameras, and I put in that stun fence and helped put that in and maintain it, and so on and so forth. Seeing the cell houses and seeing inmates that I had known and had relationships with, and some of the inmates that I ended up working for me as inmate work crews was kind of wild. And yeah, so Colorado prisons, it is what it is. The worst thing about working in Colorado prisons is the staff. Inmates are going to do what inmates are going to do. You got your murderers or rapists, you got your grand larceny, grand theft auto, GTA, all of those guys, the drug users, the gangbangers, the whole 9 yards. And then you have the child abusers and pedophiles and things like that. We have just this whole mix of dysfunction. And there's a lot of veterans that are in prison as well. So that kind of hit me in the heart as being a veteran. I never compromised the rules or my integrity with, because somebody was a veteran or somebody was a believer or whatever it is. And people will try to manipulate you and use the commonalities that you have. Hey, I like the Steelers, I like Steelers, I like this and that. And you get into more of a personal relationship. A lot of inmates will try to manipulate you and use that against you. With that being said, when I worked at Territorial, that was really interesting because we had a sergeant who worked at the gymnasium who worked there. He was assigned there. And he had worked there for, I think, over a decade. He got caught bringing drugs into the facility inside like Subway sandwich or, hoagie sandwich. So in other words, you open it up, he took the bread out and he would put drugs and marijuana and whatever else, black tar heroin and other things, hide them in a sandwich and he wrap it all up and then he comes into the facility. And then, so basically he was dealing drugs into the facility. Supposedly the Department of Corrections is all like, oh, if we catch you bringing in contraband, you're going to get fired, you're going to get charged, you're going to go to prison yourself. He had been doing this for multiple years. There was documented proof that he had been doing this. By his own admission, he had been bringing in drugs. Inmates had testified who he gave drugs to, and they caught him on camera with these inmates giving them drugs. Yeah, they just let him go. They let him resign. And that's just one of the instances. More common were the women that worked in the Department of Corrections. The majority of people that compromised by inmates and bringing in drugs or cell phones or contraband or, doing those things. And then it's like the inmates got them over a barrel. Hey, can you give me a pen? Can you just give me a pen? And mine broke, and I don't have any money in my account, and I want to write a letter to my mom. She's sick, blah, blah, blah. And, hey, Miss Correctional Officer, you're looking really nice today. Always nice and kind. And they'll use that against these female officers. So these female officers will get more attention in prison from men, kind words. Oh, you look nice, you're really good. And so they're vulnerable because what woman doesn't want to not be told that they're beautiful or attractive or, you're kind, you're pleasant. I wish we met under different circumstances, and you can see where this is going to go. So it starts with things like a pen. It will start with paper clips and things that you're not supposed to give inmates. And then it just escalates from there. The inmates write letters. Oh, I was thinking about you, and I was thinking about, my time, and I'm going to be here for a while. And if only, under different circumstances, if I had lived a different life and I didn't do the things that I did, which I know are wrong now, perhaps we would have, I would have met somebody. I would have met you under different circumstances, and we could have had a life together. You bring meaning to my life. I mean, these guys are poets. Inmates will go to the library, get poems, they'll write poems, they'll learn poetry, they'll read romance novels, the whole 9 yards, the women romance novels. And they just play this game on women correctional officers, and they get them compromised. Because now, if you bring something into an inmate, even innocuous as food or paper or things from the outside, I really like this candy bar and they don't have it on canteen here in the prison. Correctional officer, she brings it in because, he treats her nice and says she's attractive and beautiful and good heart, all of the lovey-dovey stuff. So she brings in like a Zagnut or whatever. Then he's like, well, I'd really like this. And then if she ever gets to the point of where she's like, I can't do this anymore. This isn't right. Then what he'll do is he'll say, well, wait a second. You've brought all this contraband into me. And if you don't bring in this stuff that I want, which could be prescription medications, it could be drugs, it could be cell phones, it could be, chargers, it could be weapons, whatever. If you don't do these things, then, I'm going to have to turn you in. And then of course they'll play it's this love-hate, this love-bomb relationship. Love bomb somebody and then take that away, and then the woman feels rejected, and then they'll dish out some love and try to get her back into the good graces. Eventually she brings in drugs, or if it goes to the romantic route and the inmate has relations and puts hands on and they're touchy-feely, and it's the brown chicken, brown cow type of thing that goes on, then the inmate, it's gotcha, you're done. Then what the inmate will do is say, hey, well, I need a cell phone, I need drugs, you need to contact this person or this person, they'll give you and you could bring it in, it's just for me, blah, blah, blah. And then I remember women that got turned out like that, and to where they ended up having sex with the inmate. Ooh, yuck. Why? I don't understand. And then the lady says, hey, I can't do this anymore, I got to cut off the relationship. And then, of course, the love stops. They start bombing and saying, hey, well, you already had sex with me, so if you don't have sex with me anymore, I'm going to have to turn you in, you're going to lose your job, and you're going to go to prison. And so these women freak out. And in some inmates, I have actually known female correctional officers that had sex with inmates, that the inmate said, well, if you don't have sex with me, my cellmate knows that we're having sex and he's going to turn you in. So if you don't have sex with him, he's going to turn you in and it's going to jeopardize our relationship. Yeah, and there was one where there was a lady, she had like 5 different people that she was banging. And she was a correctional officer. And it was just kind of like, oh, she had problems with inmates in this cell house, so they moved her to another cell house, and then moved her to another cell house. And it was clear as the sky is blue and water is wet that she was doing inappropriate things with inmates all throughout the facility, and they just kept moving her around like a bad penny, and she just kept popping up, and eventually, it got to the point where she was bringing in drugs, and even then, they kicked her out, and the last thing I heard about it is like they didn't know whether they were going to charge her or not. They just fired her. And now the inmates that had the relations with this correctional officer sue the state of Colorado because, hey, look what your person in charge that wasn't supposed to do that put me in an emotional state and took advantage of me because they have authority and I don't, and they forced me to have sex. Yeah, a lot of that goes around in Colorado Department of Corrections. So, yeah, I know a thing or two about prisons, and it is just, it is crazy on what you end up seeing in prison. I saw a guy try to throw himself over the 3rd tier of a cell block, 3rd floor, because he wanted to kill himself. Ended up, guys grabbing him and stuff. I actually saw that happen, and it was just only by the grace of God that there were some inmates there that actually cared, saved this guy along with a correctional officer. So there was that. Like I said, I saw some people get stabbed, saw fights, riots. That was kind of interesting. Strip outs. Did strip outs in, yeah, where everybody gets naked, bend, spread your cheeks and cough, and you have to look everywhere and make sure they're not hiding drugs. And sure enough, I've seen inmates where strings were coming out of their buttholes, and it's like, turn your, bend over, spread your cheeks and cough, and it's like, whoa, wait a second. You have the flashlight, and you're like, yeah, there's a string hanging out of this guy's ass. And so you call it in, and then they have to do the dry cell. And, if he expels said string and whatever's attached to the string, usually the prison purse, it's drugs or something of that nature. Usually it's drugs. Yeah, it just ends up, they're just crazy things that happen in prison. Crazy things. During my later years at Fremont Correctional Facility, before I quit, was drones. And it was interesting because off of watching that donut operator video, and then going through and looking at other videos of Fremont Correctional Facility and Colorado Department of Corrections, they had signs that say, no fly area, no fly, no drone zone or whatever. Just before I quit, probably about 6 to 8 months prior to that, we were having more and more instances of drones flying over the facility. And we ended up catching drones that was dropping drugs within the confines of the prison, like in the yard, things like that. We would have people at night on graveyard shift that would hear drones that were flying around, and you could see the flashing lights. Of course, they try to tape them up. But, you hear a drone flying over the exercise yard, and so they would stop, all the lights come on, and then you'd find drugs in the prison because of the drones. And so that was kind of a big thing that happened just before. Other times people would drive past prisons, and in the fields where they would do like farm work for prisons, there's public roads that are right on the side, and guys would, throw drugs out of their vehicles into those fields of where the inmates would work. Obviously, low priority, not medium or, dangerous criminals, but low priority, low risk criminals would get these work assignments to where they could work in such places. So kind of a low risk category type of inmate. But still, drugs would get there. The inmates get those drugs, they pass them on, and that's how drugs get into the facilities. So there's two ways that drugs get into the facilities: people on the outside or correctional officers, and the majority of it comes in through correctional officers. So yeah, I've seen a number of staff members that were walked out of facilities that were never charged, never ever charged, even though the Colorado Department of Corrections said that they would charge people. And it's always, don't ever bring drugs, and we're going to charge you and you'll go to prison. It's like the amount of people that get charged and the people that actually end up in prison or jail for bringing in contraband and drugs and things like that as a correctional officer, very, very few, compared to the amount of people that actually do that stuff. But then again, the Department of Corrections in Colorado isn't squeaky clean itself either. There's a number of wardens that have been, in DUIs. They got caught by air marshals of being drunk and disorderly on planes that would, in any other job, you would be fired from your job, but because they're the bigwigs in the good old boy system of CDOC, they kept their jobs. But if you had a staff member that got a DUI, they would kick him out as fast as you could blink. So, but even then, it's just like justice was not evenly served. Let's put it that way. I remember seeing a guy that worked in the Burrito Kid that I told you about. Burrito Kid ended up getting a DUI, and then he ended up he concealed carry a weapon that he wasn't supposed to because he didn't have a concealed carry permit, but he did that, so he got in trouble. But he was still allowed to keep his job. How that happened, and he was the worst guy possible. You'd find him asleep on graveyards you're supposed to be awake, and he wasn't. Late to work all the time. You write him up, it's just nothing would happen. But yeah, he got a DUI, and he was able to save his job. Then he got caught driving again on a revoked license, and they still let him work. how is that possible? And I think there was a third time he got caught with something else, and finally, after like a year after that, they ended up getting rid of getting rid of Burrito Dude. But yeah, crazy stories of what happens in the Department of Corrections. There were stories, not stories. Well, there's always stories, right? There was people that I knew. Like, there was a major that worked at Territorial Correctional Facility, and the major's daughter, the major's daughter or something like that, was married to a guy who worked on the ERT teams, kind of like the SWAT of the correctional facility. And then the sergeant that I worked for in DOC, this female sergeant, slept with her husband, and it was the niece. I think that's what it was. It was the major had a niece, and the niece was married to a guy that worked for ERT, which is kind of like SWAT. And then the sergeant that I had worked under, not literally in that manner, but worked under a number of times, that she slept with this guy, even though that she was not yet divorced, had 2 kids out of wedlock, and then she ended up getting pregnant by this guy, and this guy's wife, the niece, she was handicapped. And but yeah, so there's this whole debacle thing that went on with that, and the sergeant, she ended up like suing the department, and she ended up, because they were trying to kick her out, but she's saying, I'm pregnant and you're covering this up, and nothing's happening or whatever. And then she's trying to get child support for the child. Yeah, it was just a whole dysfunction. It made Jerry Springer look tame, is what it came down to, and all this stuff that ended up happening. So it was absolutely crazy. And the sergeant would hit up on me, and it was just like I remember it was my first day at Territorial, and I worked with her. We were in segregation, and it was me, one other guy, and her, and there was just 3 of us for the cell house. But segregation, everybody's locked down in their own individual cells, and unless there's an emergency, it's a pretty chill job. You just go check the cells every hour, and you're good to go. But yeah, she would tell me, and she would say, yeah, I'm having this and this, and then she described her whole sexual history and how she liked it up the Coolio, and how she'd get headaches, and that the only way she'd get rid of the migraines was through, doing that. And, there was a number of times that she would ask me if I could help get rid of her headaches on duty, because there was times she would disappear for, half hour, an hour, and disappear with somebody, and everybody knew what was going on. But but she held power, because she ended up having dirt not only on the ERT guy whose niece was married to the niece of a major that worked there, so there's a real weird thing. But she also had dirt on some of the wardens, and so that's how she was able to stay employed. And yeah, it was just crazy. Needless to say, there were some good people that work in the Department of Corrections, in the Colorado Department of Corrections. There was a number of good people, but the number of questionable people far outweigh those. And then you have the inmates. You have staff that are stealing stuff from the department, misappropriating funds. You had wardens that were using their security teams of driving around during hunting season, covering up for their DUIs and so on and so forth, claiming they were on official duty, and the security guard, the bodyguards for said wardens or officials would, it was bad. I remember one time I can't remember the guy's name, somebody high up in the Department of Corrections had bodyguards, and obviously a higher level staff. He took a Colorado State vehicle and his bodyguards to go out hunting, killed a deer, put it in the back of the vehicle. Of course, it bled all over the back. They didn't wrap it up well enough, and it basically ruined the vehicle, and nothing ever happened. Yeah, it was just like, doesn't matter. But anybody else under the sun in the Department of Corrections, if they did that, they would be fired in a heartbeat. They'd be, promotions would be stripped. They'd be reduced down in rank. You might be able to keep your job, but you'd have to pay money, as part of a fine or a fee or things like that. Yeah, so there's a lot of problems with the Colorado Department of Corrections. And no wonder. The way that they treat their staff and the corruption that I saw at that time, hopefully it's gotten better. I don't think it has. I recently looked, and it's like they are so understaffed in the Department of Corrections, it's not even funny. So it still continues on. Actually, there's lawsuits of people that are not getting paid the overtime that was due them, and the state settled for a lawsuit, and they settled for $5 million for all of these people that said, hey, we had to work overtime. They only paid us $2 an hour because we were on call, which in fact their own rules say that you're supposed to get more than $2. You're supposed to get 2 hours for each phone call that I would get. I would get 2 hours of work. So these people weren't getting paid for that. They're getting called in. They weren't getting overtime hours. So in other words, they were shifting and moving the hours from different times so they didn't have to pay overtime. Yeah, it was times where there was another thing where it ended up that you would have to come into work 15, 20 minutes early, but you didn't get paid for that time. You got paid when you started your work, not during the briefing, but that's a work briefing. There's actually a lawsuit for that. So yeah, it's Colorado Department of Corrections is just constantly has lawsuits, not only from inmates but staff as well, and it's just absolutely crazy. I'm amazed. I thought the military was jacked up. The Army is a fine, well-oiled, high-performance machine compared to the Colorado Department of Corrections. I'll tell you that right now. So, absolutely crazy. So anyway, that's what this whole thing is. Colorado prisons, yeah, I know a thing or two about them. I spent like 10, almost 11 years working in the Colorado Department of Corrections. Ended up as a, knuckle dragging guard. I did that for a couple of years, training officer, and then I ended up getting promoted to lieutenant, security electronics, and so on and so forth. Strip out, cell searches, the whole 9 yards, dry cell watch. Ugh, I hated those things. It just, man, riots, been involved in a couple riots, but yeah, as cleanup and things like that. It's just crazy. Crazy, crazy, crazy. Then you have the inmates, as I'm twirling this pen around, I'm kind of like, this brought to mind, we had an inmate that he was going to be in prison the rest of his life. He was a problem child in all the prisons that he went to, and they would shuffle him around. And what he would do is, if he didn't get his way, he would self-harm. Well, there's this thing in Colorado Department of Corrections where usually if you act like an idiot and you're a knucklehead and you break the rules and you do drugs and fights and all that stuff, you're penalized and your personal items get taken away, like your TV, your radio, and this and that, and so on and so forth. You get put into segregation. You get whatever small things, benefits that you get, those are taken away because it's this carrot and stick type of mentality. If you do well and your behavior is good, you will get rewarded by getting additional benefits and better treatment and so on and so forth. Conversely, on the other side of the coin, if you don't, those things will be taken away. This guy figured out, along with a few other inmates that had done this, when he wouldn't get his way, he would self-harm himself. And this one guy, what he would end up doing is getting Skillcraft pens like this and buy him off a canteen, and he would insert it inside himself in a certain body part that would protrude from between his legs, and then he would set it on the table, and then he would smash it and break the plastic pen until it shattered, and then he would have to go to the hospital and get surgeries and so on and so forth. This was also a guy that would eat and swallow batteries. He would rip smoke detectors off the wall, and he'd tear the stuff up, and he'd eat the parts, and of course it'd rip up his insides. He'd have to go get surgery. But eventually, that was his game, as he said, well, I want my TV back. Even though he is the one that picked up his TV and smashed it on the floor, because this guy was such a problem child, wardens were like, give him a TV. Just make this go away. And it's like, okay, I've got some TVs because I would do TV repair and stuff like that as well as in prison. one of the jobs of electronics. So, and it's like, but he broke his last TV. He ate the glass from his TV, and he tried to kill himself with the remnants and the shattered pieces of his old TV. And now he wants a new TV because he was being punished for, you know what I mean? It was just this never-ending circle. And the warden's like, no, damn it, give him a TV. And it's like, okay, well, I do my emails, cover my CYA, cover my ass. And it ends up, he would get the TV, and then he would say, well, now I want a radio. And now I want this, and I want canteen, and I want, I want new tennis shoes, tennis shoes. And if you don't give them to me, I'm going to self-harm myself. I remember he ended up breaking something, and he cut his arm, and in the laceration in his arm, he shit in his hand and stuffed the wound with feces. And didn't tell anybody. So he'd wrap it up with clothing, and he just let it get infected. And over time, and eventually he started to sweat, and he's having all the, oh, dude, what's wrong? And it's, he's about to pass out. They take him to medical. They do a once over, and they see the bandage, the homemade bandage. Yeah, and there's the festering feces inside his large gaping wound that he gave to himself. And he would swear up and down, if you don't give me if you don't give me a good bunk, if you don't give me a good cell, if you don't give me yard time, I'm going to keep harming myself. And there's inmates that do that. You have inmates that will shit on themselves and put it all over the walls. You have people that do that. And usually, we're not talking about the 20% of people that are innocent that are sent to prison by illegal charges and so on and so forth. The people that are in prison are there for a reason. And if you're in a state prison, you've had to do some pretty bad stuff. And so automatically it goes into question whether these people are in their right mind or not. In a highly supervised facility or situation, they can be okay. But when left to their own devices, even though there's cameras watching 24/7, these people, these knuckleheads, will still do wrong, as long as the day is wrong. They will commit assaults. They'll, do drugs. They'll do this and that, lie, cheat, steal. Force people into prostitution. That's another great thing that happens in prison. It doesn't get a lot of airtime. It's just not good. Prison is not good, and it's not a vocation that people dream about. As a child, usually, I want to be a fireman, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a nurse, I want to be, I want to be a EMT, I'm going to be a soldier, I'm going to be a prison guard, I want to work in prison. No kid ever says that. It's like the bottom of the barrel of jobs, in my opinion. But I needed a job, and it had good pay compared to the lack of jobs that we had at that time, and for my skill set, it was like a no-brainer. But still, the stress of that was something. It was just like, what, I didn't take the retirement option. I took the 401k, the para thing, and for me to retire, I would have to work until I was almost 70, and that wasn't going to happen. And so it ended up too much stress, dealing with mental health problems on my own, and then compounding that with the prison work and the stress of the staff, inmates, the whole 9 yards, people trying to tell you your job, and you're like, yeah, you don't even know what's positive and negative on a D-cell battery, and you're trying to tell me how to do my job as an electronics technician? No, you're just trying to tell me how to do my job because you're high rank and you just got some chip on your shoulder, but I'm telling you, this isn't how it's going to work. And so you get all that. You get it in the military, you get it in law enforcement and things like that. But it is incrementally worse in a Department of Corrections. People that have no clue whatsoever about what they're doing. Total idiots will rise to the top. Not like cream, but more like curdled milk in the Department of Corrections. And unfortunately, it's an attrition game. If you can, have your face up your boss's ass so much and blow him, you can stick around and you can go far in the Department of Corrections. Now, to be fair, there's also good people in the Department of Corrections, but again, they're outnumbered. at least at the time that I was there. I don't know what it's like now. It's been a number of years, but yeah, it's just interesting. You got staff members that get convicted of drug use and so on and so forth, DUIs. I remember we had a staff that got convicted of a DUI, and usually that would mean, hey, well, you're fired because you can't drive into work. And he's like, oh, I can work. But he knew somebody. He was part of that good old boy network, and he was able to, get rides from people and keep his job for a while. And then he got another DUI, and then he got fired. So, yeah, it's just this weird dynamic. And, in a place where there's so much dysfunction and toxicity and lack of moral characters and no moral compass, it's hard to find a moral compass in prison. It's very few and far between. I'm talking inmates and staff. But, combine all that. And then you combine the fact that when you work in a prison, you have to realize that people in prison don't have the same moral values that you do. They're deficient. When you have somebody that rapes babies, when you have somebody that are rapists and murderers, when you have people that are drug users and addicts and, turning people out for tricks in the prisons, and then you have the gangs. We didn't even talk about the gangs, the Crips and the Bloods and the Aryans and, the Mexican gangs and all of those things, of course, being in Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado gangs, what are the odds of that happening, and things that, you have inmates that never cause any problems during their entire lives, let alone their prison life, that will just suddenly have to beat up somebody, and that's because they were told to do it, because if they don't do it, then they're going to get raped. Or they're going to get beat, or they're going to get killed. So under the threat of being raped and killed, I have the choice of go beating this guy up or this. So you can have somebody that's totally innocent, doesn't want to play the prison game, just wants to do their own time. They don't have a choice. So, yeah, bad company corrupts good morals. And that is so true, especially in prison. It's very, very hard. I've seen guys in prison that were convicted of drug charges, massive drug charges, and they ended up turning their lives around, living for God and the whole 9 yards, what is that? Covey's, successful habits, 12 successful habits of motivated people or whatever the hell it was. That whole thing, going through, you have inmates that went through that course, taught that course, teaching Bible studies, getting an education, getting degrees, and so on and so forth while they're in prison. It's like, man, these people have really turned their lives around. And then they get out. Less than a year later, Joe Blow comes back in because he had 2 pounds of meth and, firearms, and convicted of drug dealing again. When if he just, and he's like, hey, he said, it's just, I folded. I made a bad decision. And that's the problem, is that these people, a lot of people don't have the moral compass and they make bad decisions. But it's even deeper to a point of where they don't have that compass that says, raping a baby, stealing a car, killing somebody, robbing a store, blah, 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 blah. There's nothing that goes off that says, you know what? I just spent 10 years in prison for a lot of those things. Maybe I shouldn't do it again. Kind of like that Kyle Williamson guy, he did 11 years prior. And it's like, he's out. He was out. And then what does he end up doing? Yeah, I think it's a good idea to commit crimes and run from the police and shoot at police and shoot officers. And then, yeah, the brain doesn't work right in a lot of these people. And I think that's the biggest problem with people who try to work in the Department of Corrections, is it's normal people who haven't experienced a lot of toxicity or dysfunction in their lives, kind of like being in the military, some really crazy stuff. They don't understand, and they think that everybody is like them, that everybody knows the difference between right and wrong. Inmates will tell you, oh yeah, I know what I did was wrong, and I'm rehabilitated, kind of like, what was that, Shawshank Redemption, Red, oh, I'm rehabilitated. You just write that down in your report, Sonny, and, if I could go back in time, I would. They'll say the exact same things and even more. And over long periods of time, it will make you believe that they have turned a leaf. And then as soon as they get out or go to another prison, or next thing you know, it's like, dude, we did a cell search and we watched you and get drugs and bring them back to your cell, and we saw you doing drugs and talking about dealing drugs, because we put microphones into your cells. I got to do that stuff. To help convict these guys of dealing drugs in prison and so on and so forth. And of course, sometimes there are staff involved in that as well. So, it's very hard. And I think people that work in the Department of Corrections that are normal don't understand that. They think, we all tend to think that everybody is just like us, that we have the same moral values to some degree, and that there are some things that we just don't do. But they don't understand that a lot of these people are in prison because they did the things that they did because they don't have a moral compass. So, yeah, it's the prison is weird. As far as benefits, great job. Good benefits, good pay, overtime. Of course, if the state doesn't pay you the benefits that you're due, the overtime that you're due, that's kind of screwed. So that's why they're having a second lawsuit for that whole thing. I mentioned that before. The state had to pay out $5 million, and then now it's just like a year or two later, and it's the exact same thing again. The exact same thing. And the Department of Corrections just can't enforce its own rules, even when they've had lawsuits and lost against staff who said, yeah, you told me I was going to get overtime. These are my pay. These are my times. This is this. And then to say, yeah, you're absolutely right. You should have got paid, and we didn't pay you, but we're not going to pay you. And so it had to go to court. And then Colorado lost. And yet it's happening again. Crazy stuff. Misappropriation of funds, equipment. I've seen a lot of that. Crazy stuff. I don't know. It is what it is. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of rant and rave about that because I was watching Donut Operator in that video and saw Kyle Williamson, and unfortunately, he was kind of an ass when I knew him at Fremont Correctional Facility. He was always mean mugging me, mean mugging, which is like trying to intimidate me through mean looks or bad looks. He'd always try to insult me, call me names. What are you going to do about it, pig? And it's like absolutely nothing. That's not in my job description to respond to you calling me a fag or whatever. I wouldn't let him get under my skin. And eventually, over the years, it was a number of years, and it ended up that we actually got on a more speaking basis. And I just wouldn't let him get under my skin. And what happened was, as I was going through a cell house, this was a turning point, because actually the only reason he changed his behavior is because I did something for him. So we're going through, I'm replacing lights and smoke detectors in the cells. It was his cell that was him and his roommate, his cellie. I was replacing some lights, and the smoke detector needed changing out. Well, it ends up that his TV that he had, they're crap anyway. The clear tunes, the clear plastic so you can see everything in there. Well, it had been used and abused, and his TV wasn't working. And of course, he's treating me like shit all these years, and I'm still being a professional. And his cellmate was actually the one, because his cellmate didn't have a TV, but his cellmate was cool. His cellmate was always cool with me. And he said, hey, I'm wondering, Will, if you could, take a look at the TV there. I said, you don't have a TV. He says, yeah, I know, but he lets me watch the TV, but the TV's messed up. So I'm like, I don't know. So it ends up that Kyle walks in, I have the TV, and I'm looking at it, he goes, what are you doing? What are you fucking with my TV for? He said, first of all, you need to chill. I'm not doing anything to your TV except maybe possibly fixing it because your cellie asked me to. And he's like, and apparently people don't do nice things to inmates a lot of times. And I was kind of one of the rare cases. I said, you always give me a hard time, and right now my first instinct is just telling you to pack sand and to put the TV down, and I will never do anything for you ever again. You call me a jerk, dick, all this stuff, and you give me a hard time. You're mean mugging me, bulldogging me, and all this stuff, trying to get a reaction out of me. I said, I could just leave right now. I said, but your celly's cool, and I'm going to give you one last chance, and if you ask me nicely, I'll fix your TV. So he's like, and it was weird because you could see the gears grinding because he didn't know what to do with it. But then he wanted his TV fixed, but he didn't, because he hated guards. And so he's like, well, yeah, you can do it if you want. I said, well, it's your TV. It's if you want. I don't care. This is on you. And he goes, yeah, if you could fix it, that'd be cool, man. I'd appreciate that. So I fixed his TV, and then we ended up having, obviously, a better relationship. Because TVs are expensive and state pay for inmates is kind of low. And of course, if you have to pay restitution out of your pay, that comes out of the inmate pay, which I think at the time was like $20 a month, 20, $25 a month, something like that. And if you have restitution, there's 10% of that's got to come out for restitution. And if you owe money to this or that or whatever, that's even less. Yeah, just kind of interesting stuff. So just a weird dynamic. And, a lot of times, because I had something that they wanted, I would use, and I wasn't forbidden from fixing things, like connectors on their TV. I wasn't forbidden from doing that. I wasn't ordered to do that, but I could. But at times, the cell house captains and sergeants would say, hey, could you do this favor for me and fix this guy's connector? Or could you, fix the end on his cable that goes from the wall to the TV? It's not working. He's a pretty decent Joe and whatever, And so it got to the point of where I was always nice to people. I was professional. I didn't take any crap. Of course, I was in the military. Of course, I'm not going to take any crap. But it ends up that guys would see me and then word would get around and people would treat me nice. And one last story before I go, because I think I heard some people coming in. I got to get some food, it's our anniversary today. Now, remember how I talked about the guy who did meth, who caught the additional 14-year charge? I forget his name. I can see his face plain as day. He worked the work order cart for lights and so on and so forth. I can see his face. But anyway, what was I talking about? It was the, treating people with respect. Because I treated that guy with respect, and I wasn't a dick, and I still enforced the rules, but then, there's times where we could help out as we could that wasn't against the rules. That I remember one time I'm getting my tools, I'm getting on my toolboxes, have my other guys with me, and he comes up to me, and it's, what was his name? Dang it. It's like Marty, I think it began with an M. I don't know, but anyway. So he comes up to me and he's like, we're getting our stuff together, and he's like, hey, Sergeant Wilson. He was like, at the time I was sergeant. No, I was lieutenant. He goes, hey, Lieutenant Wilson. He goes, hey, I was wondering, I saw you were doing some work orders. Where are you going to be working at in the facility? And this was at Fremont. And I said, well, I got a bunch of work orders, and because they hand out work orders, and I get the stack, and me and my guys go work. He would go and work and do some stuff, supervised by staff. And I said, well, I've got work orders for 2 and 3, and then I got one for 5, and then I got some at the kitchen and on that side of the facility. And he's like, oh. He goes, yeah. So you're going to do that this morning? I'm like, yeah, that's the plan right now. And he says, so do you got some on the other side of the facility? I'm like, oh yeah, I got work orders in cells 6 and 7. I got some stuff I got to do in the library, and down some maintenance work in the gym and so on and so forth. And he's like, yeah, you might want to, if it was me, just might want to do that other side of the facility first, and in the afternoon, go work cells 2, 3, and 4, or 5 or whatever else, and east side versus west side. I'm like, really? Huh? Okay, I will. And of course, then I tell my boss about it, and he's like, yeah. So we reported it up, and let the higher ups know that, hey, something's not right, because this guy is telling me not to go to that side of the facility and to work on the other side. And it's not because, he's trying to set me up or anything, but it was just, yeah, you might want to do some work elsewhere on the other side and then come back. So we put that through the chain, and so I ended up going working on the other side of the facility. And sure enough, that morning there was a gang fight that kicked off between cell houses 2 and 3, right where I was supposed to be working on some cameras on the outside. So yeah, there is this weird respect dynamic that is in prison. So yeah, I remember coming back and I heard it on the radio. At the time that I was, we were going to go to cells 2 and 3. And sure enough, by the time I get to the first place on the other side of the facility, boom, the gang fight kicks off in the whole 9 yards. What was the guy's Martin? Was it Martin? Oh, I can't remember. Dang it. So anyway, I get back, and in the afternoon when we turn in all our tools and, we pat everybody down, we're going to go to lunch and stuff like that. He comes up and he goes, hey, he says, you hear what happened at Cell House 2 and 3? And I'm like, yep, sure did. Yeah, it's a good thing. It's a good thing I did that stuff on the other side of the facility. And he was like, yeah, that's probably a good idea that you decide to work that instead of this side. And so it's just kind of a weird thing, But then there's also stories that I heard in accounts of inmates that would try to set up staff and put them into places where they didn't want to be, but they tried to make them to be in that situation, and bad things would happen. So it's just this weird thing, working in prisons. And it's, if you can read people, you can do well, and you can keep yourself safe from stuff like that. And I will tell you, I've got this bullshit detector that if the back of the hair on my neck starts going squirrely and my stomach is just, my gut is like, oh no, something is not right, listen to that. And there's been more than one occasion where that has actually helped me a lot with working in corrections. But the majority of people who work corrections are totally clueless and don't have that little voice or that gut that says, hey, this is wrong, like milk in a bowl wrong. A lot of people don't have that. So, but yeah, it's very interesting working in prisons. So unfortunately, like I said, my real dad went to prison. He died in prison. I didn't get a chance to meet him again. And I was actually to the point of where I was working in corrections. I was like, you know what? I want to close this chapter. I want to, because we left on bad terms. Things weren't good. And I wanted to come back and visit my dad, and which I could do. That's totally allowable. So I was putting the paperwork together to actually go see him, and just to see how he's doing and to show him that I turned out okay. I was married, had a daughter, did the military, did a career. And he was a veteran. He was a military veteran from Vietnam. So I just kind of wanted to close out that chapter and tell him that I turned out okay, and that, that I appreciated him. But it didn't happen because he ended up dying, and I never got the opportunity to. So kind of missed out on that. But, it is what it is. It's that whole circle of life. Things go on, and if you got the opportunity to do things like that, then take them. But then there's also the other side of the coin. If people are extremely toxic, then there's some people that you need to cut out of your life and not have anything to do with them at all. And somewhere in between, we have these healthy relationships that we should foster in our lives and protect and guard and have boundaries to keep our mental health and our family safe. So yeah, I think a lot of that is not being taught in our society. And as we continue, we have more and more people going to prison. We have more and more people who have lost their moral compass. And we're getting more and more people that are breaking the law and don't care, and they don't know how to react. They don't know how to process. They don't know how to be sociable. They don't know how to be a good person because they weren't raised to be good to begin with. So yeah. Anyway, so that's the exciting story of prisons and how I know a couple of things about them, a little bit of my background and history, and my dad, who had 3,009 years. I think it was 2,009 years is what he ended up having on his official thing of when he was going to be done with prison. So obviously he was never getting out. But yeah, it's very interesting. But just looking back at all the times that I went through in corrections and through my life, and now I've retired early, it's like, wow, to be able to go through all that crap and to still have a good family and to have a good life and retire early is just, sometimes it boggles the imagination. It boggles my mind that I didn't end up being in prison myself. Of course, that's a whole nother story. I'm glad I didn't get caught for the things that I was doing. Let's put it that way, because then I definitely wouldn't have been able to be in the military, and I probably would have ended up in prison. So, anyway, have you spent a night in jail? Have you been in prison? Do you work in prison? Do you know anybody that's in prison? Family members, friends, whatever. Would you like to go to prison? Probably not. I don't recommend it, even as a guard. It's not something I would promote. Put it in the comment section down below, and we'll see you on the next video. Okay? Peace. Wow. Crazy stuff.